Good day, everyone. We are the Group 1 and we will be discussing the basic concept of disaster. Our presentation consists of first, the concept of disaster risk, nature of disaster, and effects of disaster. Let's start.
For the first part of this topic, we have the concept of disaster. So, before we proceed, let's define what a disaster is first. Disaster came from the word disastre, which literally means a bad star or an evil star. So, it is a serious disruption in the functioning of the community or a society, causing widespread material, economic, social, or environmental losses which exceed the ability of the affected society to cope using its own resources. It is a sudden event, bringing the great damage, loss, destruction, and devastation to life and property. So basically, this means that a disaster is somewhat a phenomenon that causes damage and destruction to properties and can cause injuries to life, and it is too big for our society to handle and to recover from. So you can also define disaster as a result from the combination of hazards, vulnerabilities, and insufficient capacity. Now, how and when would we know that an event is a disaster? So it only happens when a hazard impacts on a certain vulnerability, like population, and it causes damage, casualties, or destruction to the population. So there are two categories of hazards. There are man-made and there are natural hazards. So for example, an earthquake occurred in an inhabited desert. So can we consider it as a disaster? No, we can't. However, if it occurred in a place where there are people and they could be affected together with their activities and properties, then yes, it could be considered as a disaster. In this chart, you'll see a list of possible causes and events that could possibly trigger the occurrence of a disaster. Here at this point, you could conclude that a disaster can only occur when hazards and vulnerability meet. It is also important to know that with the greater capacity of the individual or community and environment to face these disasters, the impact of hazard reduces. For additional information, hazard is a dangerous condition or event that has a potential threat for causing injury to life or damage to property or the environment itself. It has two categories: natural, which are caused by natural phenomena like cyclones, tsunamis, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions, and there are also man-made, which are produced by humans. For example, leakage of toxic wastes, pollution, or dam failure. Vulnerability, on the other hand, is the extent to which a community, structure and services, or geographic area is likely to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of a particular hazard on account to their surroundings or places. It also has two categories: physical vulnerability and socio-economic vulnerability. Physical vulnerability is based on the physical condition of the people and elements at risk, while socio-economic vulnerability is the degree to which a population is affected by a hazard and socio-economic conditions are involved. Capacities, meanwhile, are the resources which enable the society to withstand, prepare, prevent, or recover from a disaster. The difference between a hazard and a disaster is that a hazard is a situation or event that carries a threat to humans, while disaster is an event that harms humans and disrupts the livelihood or society.
Hello everyone. I will be discussing the concept of disaster risk. What is a disaster risk? It is the probability that a community's geographic area is to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of a particular hazard. It is derived from the interaction of social and environmental process, which is a combination of physical hazards and vulnerability exposed. Therefore, it is the combination of the severity and frequency of a hazard, the numbers of people and assets exposed to the hazard, and their vulnerability to damage. So it means that the disaster risk is the chance or the possibility of a particular geographical area to be hit or damaged by a hazard. There are 5 characteristics of disaster risk. The first one is forward-looking. It considers the future and possibilities like loss of life, destruction, and damage in given a limited time. It means that there is always damage occurred in any form when a disaster happens. The second one is dynamic. It will help to increase or decrease according to our ability to reduce vulnerability. It means that it can increase or decrease our vulnerability to damage. The third one is invisible. It is comprised of not only the threat of high-impact events, but also the frequent low-impact events that are often hidden or more likely unexpected. Basically, it means that disasters are unexpected and we should always be ready for it. The fourth is unevenly distributed around the Earth. The hazards affect different areas, but the pattern of it reflects the social construction of exposure and vulnerability in different countries. The level of risk depends on the exposure and vulnerability of a particular place or area. The fifth one is emergent and complex. There are many processes, including climate change and globalized economic development, which create new interconnected risks. Developments such as technological, economical, or any other type always pose a risk to us humans. How do we measure disaster risk? To measure disaster risk, we can analyze trends of, for instance, previous disaster losses. These trends can help us to gauge whether disaster risk reduction is being effective and also estimate future losses by conducting a risk assessment. A comprehensive risk assessment considers the full range of potential disaster events and their underlying possibilities and uncertainties. These assessments are used to identify specific risks within a framework of source of hazards, which are called agents of deterioration, and identify expected frequency of risk events ranging from continuous to less than one event per century. How do we reduce disaster risk? To reduce a disaster risk or recover from it, these are the 4 possible activities to execute. Prevention. It is the outright avoidance of adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. An example of that is when we transfer to the evacuation center. Mitigation. It is the lessening or minimizing of the adverse impacts of a hazardous events. One example of mitigation is when we fix the roof of our houses in order to strengthen it for it to withstand the damage of the disaster. Risk transfer. It is the process of formally or informally shifting the financial consequences of particular risk from one party to another group who will obtain resources from them after a disaster occurs, in exchange for ongoing or compensatory social or financial benefits. Preparedness. It is the knowledge and capacities of known groups or professionals to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of likely imminent or current disasters. Intensive risk. It is a disaster risk associated with low probability, high impact events, whereas extensive risk is associated with high probability, low impact events. Formula for disaster risk. Hazard, exposure, and vulnerability is equals to risk. Or hazard, vulnerability, or manageability or capacity is equals to risk. Manageability. It is the degree wherein community can intervene and manage the hazard in order to reduce its potential impact.
Natures of disaster. Disaster can be categorized into two, the natural and the human-made disaster. The first one is the natural disaster. These types of disaster originate from different forces of nature. It is also similar to natural hazards, especially the examples. However, in this, a disaster have occurred, thus it is called as natural disaster. So, as said earlier, natural disasters are caused by nature. That is why we humans have no control over it. When natural hazards destroy people's lives and livelihoods, we call them disaster. Examples of these are earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, typhoons, cyclones, and many more. The second one is the human-made disaster. These types of disasters occur due to people's negligence, such as against human, material, and environment. Human-made disaster can be an accident or intentional. Examples of these are transport and industrial accidents like air and land transportation crashes, chemical spills, building collapses, terrorism, and many other. So in this slide, we can see a table of areas and locations that are exposed to natural and man-made hazards. Examples are coastal areas are exposed to storm surge, tsunami, and tidal waves. Another is the near oil depots are exposed to oil spill and pollution. So why do we need whether an area or location is exposed to hazards? It is important to identify areas and locations that are exposed to hazards so that we can assess the risks and minimizing the damage that they may cause. We cannot prevent a disaster to happen, but we can minimize the damage that they may cause. So natural and man-made disasters can occur anywhere, and they do not discriminate between people. Therefore, it is best to know about them and learn to minimize the extent of damage caused by them.
So, the next slide is about 8 effects of disaster. So, the first one is the medical effect, which includes traumatic injuries, emotional stress and aftershocks, epidemic and indigenous diseases, which make the aftermath of a disaster worse as it is. So the best example of it is what we have experienced last November and December. So the second one is damage to critical facilities. So the disaster can damage or destroy facilities that are necessary, especially in the time of disaster. So the example of facilities that may be damaged during a disaster are the communication installations, transmission facilities, hospital, electricity, and water facilities, and etc. So, having damage during a time of disaster make it hard for the victims or the place to recover from it. So that's the second effect of disaster. Next slide. So the next slide is about the third and fourth effect of disaster. So number 3, disruption of transportation. It makes rescue and other emergency operation difficult because of its effect of restricted mobility. So either the ways or roads are blocked or damaged due to the disaster, or the operation of transportation is only limited. So the fourth one is economic impact. It makes business operations and other economic activities like farming and working stop, delayed, or either curtailed. So in this situation, usually finances resources are limited or there are none. And in terms of businesses, the production rate might be high and the sales are low, which is really bad. And in farming, the crops are damaged or either it got destroyed or died during the time of disaster. So that's the third and fourth effect of disaster.
Good day, I am Sophia Angeline Y. Ruidera, and I will be explaining the other 4 effects of disaster. The 5th effect brought by disaster is a global environmental change. It brought changes that could result in a wide range of more hazards in the future, such as wildfires, reduced productivity in life and in the ocean, and worse, weakened immune systems of both people and animals. As said in the examples, wildfires can cause a very destructive change in the environment. First, it causes damage to the ecosystem by burning off plants and trees, which are most likely habitats of various species of animals. Second, wildfires have the potential to wipe out a large number of populations of humans, animals, and plants. Lastly, wildfires emit carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere. The next effect brought by disasters is the social and political impact. It brings much devastating results and heavy recovery, especially in developing countries. One example is when the Super Typhoon Yolanda hit the Philippines back in 2013. Many people lost their homes and jobs during that time, which alarmed the national government on funding and helping the province on recovering. The affected provinces were placed under a state of national calamity, allowing the government to use state funds for relief and rehabilitation. Approximately 30.6 million pesos had been allocated in relief assistance by the NDRRMC, and the government deployed thousands of personnel, vehicles, seagoing vessels, and aircraft for rescue operations. Next is the effect of displaced populations. According to the World Health Organization, displaced people are people who had to leave their homes as a result of a natural, technological, or deliberate event. It causes a large influx of refugees that can disrupt accessibility of healthcare and education, as well as food and water supplies, resulting to food scarcity. This means that people who evacuate to safer areas may cause a shortage of food, water, and medical needs due to their high demand. For the last effect brought by disasters is the individual impact. It is an impact that can be felt physically, emotionally, and mentally by an individual. Main possible triggering causes are loss of life, illness, devastation of homes, destruction of property, and loss of financial resources. This effect refers to the damage done by the disaster to a person, which might be injuries, long-term illnesses, post-traumatic disorder, grief, depression, and others. For additional information, there are 6 different perspectives of disaster. First one is the physical perspective. This perspective refers to the destruction of physical properties or objects, such as infrastructures, shelters, buildings, and many more. The second perspective is the psychological perspective. These are the effects felt by a person emotionally and mentally. A person may experience post-traumatic stress disorder or depression due to the disaster. Third is the socio-cultural perspective. Socio-cultural attitudes could influence a particular society in terms of disaster readiness. Urban cities tend to be more ready for disasters with the help of accessible technology and funds, while rural provinces might lack in funds and technology to be ready for a massive disaster. For the fourth perspective, economic perspective, it refers to the changes in economic status, employment rate, and consumption of products after a disaster. Next is the political perspective, the response of either national or local government to the disaster. And lastly, the biological perspective refers to the environmental damage caused by the disaster. That's all for the basic concept of disaster. I hope you understood and enjoyed our presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask any members of the Group 1. Thank you.